So welcome. So Oren, I'm going to introduce you and let everybody know a little bit about you. So Oren is the vice president of the Center of Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League, and his team combats extremism, terrorism, and all forms of hate in the real world and online. Oren is recognized as the foremost authority on extremism, and the center provides resources, expertise, and training, which enables law enforcement, public officials, and internet and technology companies to identify and counter emerging threats. So Oren joined the Anti-Defamation League in 1998. And before that, he worked for the New York Times and the Jewish Community Federation in San Francisco. And much of Oren's 21 years with the ADL has been devoted to evaluating the different activities and tactics of extremist groups and movements from across the ideological spectrum, training law enforcement officers and publishing reports and articles on a wide range of extremist topics. In 2006, Oren was recognized by the FBI for his exceptional service in the public interest, and he was named to the Forward list of 50 influential, intriguing, and inspiring American Jews in 2019. Oren is a graduate of Wheaton College in Massachusetts. So with that, I turn things over to Oren, who's going to speak for a little bit first, just about the general kind of landscape. I'll then ask him a number of questions based on what he speaks about, and we'll leave time in our 50-minute presentation for people to type in questions. And by the way, don't wait. If he says something that's interesting that you have a question, he won't answer it till the end, but feel free to type it into the chat at any point. So without further ado, I turn things over to Oren.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I appreciate it. And thank you all for making the time. I do wonder what would attract all of you to join a discussion about extremism at a time where we're in the middle of a pandemic and a pretty difficult election. I mean, you just want to suffer? Or so here's the deal. I promise I will have some hopeful thoughts here. This is not all doom and gloom, even though the work that I do every day, focuses on the dark side of things. So again, as the rabbi mentioned, I've been with ADL for a long time. I have the pleasure of working with a team of analysts and investigators. These are journalists, former military, academics, who spend their time every single day in the spaces that extremists spend their time, which means they're spending time also where your kids and grandkids are spending their time every day. Right? I mean, I've always found it interesting that as sort of time has changed, I look at where, my kids are getting their entertainment and their music and their communication with their friends. And then I go to work and it's the same space that my investigators are looking for bad guys. That's just sort of says it all about the environment that we're in. And I think we're in a particularly interesting, challenging time. And what I'm going to focus on is not so much sort of the work that we do every day to investigate, to be in the spaces where extremists are, but to contextualize a little bit about what we're seeing about extremism, right now, at a time where, extremism and hate, tends to lead the headlines in our newspapers. It's certainly on TV almost every single day. And in a time where there's great polarization, great concern, just fear and anxiety more broadly, uncertainty because of a pandemic. I think it's important for us to contextualize it. So let me start by saying this. Many of you have probably heard of sort of, this concept of a civil war. We're heading towards a civil war. Let me promise you, we're not going to be seeing a civil war before November 3rd. Listen, I don't think we're going to see a civil war after November 3rd. But I think there are certain things that we have to keep in mind and that I know are on people's minds, right? And so the first is that we need to be mindful in the work that we do looking at extremism and hate of not amplifying these hateful voices and unintentionally doing their work for them. So I'll be honest with you. I see how extremists are talking about trying to leverage this crisis of a pandemic. I've seen how they've talked about maybe they should go poll watching, right? In terms of some of these groups. Maybe they should make sure that they, are seen or intimidate. And we've seen over the last 6 months, whether it's reopen protests or social justice protests, people have had practice. They've come out heavily armed to try to be seen. But I actually don't think that that's what we're going to face. I don't think that's what's going to convince people to stay at home or not vote if they haven't already voted by mailing it in. I think what we see every single day on our phones, and even in our public discussion, the disinformation, I think that has a bigger silencing effect than any extremist movement. Listen, there are a lot of extremists in this country, but this is a country of 320 million people, right? We have to remember that whether it's militias or white supremacists, racists or anti-Semites, Islamophobes or Islamists, these are fringe characters in this country. Now, they could do a lot of damage, right? I mean, we are just a couple of days past the anniversary of a shooting in Pittsburgh, right? The deadliest attack against the Jewish community in American history. So we don't have a luxury to ignore these threats, but what we need to do, what we have to do, is keep them in context. And so it's that context that I think we have some good news and bad news. So let's start with the bad news. The bad news is conspiracy theories, which are the lifeblood of extremist movements, are more popular, more accessible than ever before. Now, I have anecdotal evidence where I've never had so many people reach out to me, friends, family, acquaintances, and say, my son or, my sibling or my in-law, is going down this path of radicalization. They believe that QAnon is real, right? They believe that there is a cabal of pedophiles that are, running a deep state that are trying to take over the government. And I hear that in a way that I've never heard other people seek for advice, like how do I walk them off that ledge? And then I see data that talks about 30 million people in this country believe to some degree the conspiracies of QAnon. Conspiracies, by the way, that are built on the sort of concepts that have animated anti-Semitism over many years, right? Control, power, a secret sort of society that's controlling. I mean, you dig close enough to any conspiracy theory, it eventually leads to some form of anti-Semitism, I believe. And so there's a belief there. There's also an emboldened culture of violence in this country. Now, violence is not the sole domain of any one extremist movement. It's not uniquely right. It's not uniquely left. But what we have seen in this country is that it's uniquely normalized in a way that is not in many other, at least Western countries. And so when we have reopened protests, right after the pandemic, and people are viewing their state governments who are trying to figure out a way to, make people safe from a very confusing pandemic, and people come out in the streets and talk about tyrants and compare governors to Hitler, and that the rules that they're putting in to keep people safe is akin to, trying to exterminate 6 million Jews, that's a little extreme, right? That takes the public discourse to a level in which, having a real discussion is difficult. But it also emboldens those who, frankly, are looking for a reason to blame somebody else for the situation that they're in. So after the reopened protests, where literally oath keepers, 3%ers, right-wing militias were showing up at state capitals armed to the teeth, we had these social justice protests in this country. Now, some of them, devolved into riots and property destruction. The majority of Black Lives Matter protests, by the way, were peaceful. But this was also an opportunity for those who had brought out their guns to come out, right? And to, again, show a demonstration of force, because it was no longer just them against the government, it was right against left. Here's a big problem in this country, and I think we see it in our public discussion. But when people are starting to organize armed rallies in opposition to the radical left, and when the public discussion in this country is one in which Democrats are conflated with the radical left, that is unhealthy. At the same time, when some on the left feel like the only way to combat hatred is to physically confront people in the street, the punch the Nazi sort of idea, that too normalizes violence. Now, I want to be clear about this, and I feel like this will probably elicit some conversation and I'm ready, and I want to engage in this. There is no comparison between right-wing extremism and violence in this country and that on the left. For example, the data that we have collected in terms of extremist-related murders in this country, over the past 10 years, 75% have been carried out by right-wing extremists. That's anti-government extremists, white supremacists. About 24% have been carried out by those who subscribe to sort of ISIS and Al-Qaeda ideologies. And then there's this sort of 1% that is a combination of Black nationalism, and most recently in Portland, Oregon, the first time somebody who self-identified as Antifa killed anybody in this country. And so we need to understand the proportions here. And by the way, I will say this again, we don't have a luxury to ignore extremism from any side. We can't apologize for anybody who views violence as the way. But as this election continues, and I see those who are talking about poll watching, and I'm not talking about the president who is talking about that. I'm talking about oath keepers, right? People on the right who believe in conspiracy theories, illegitimate government, tyrannical government, that those people are starting to talk about showing up, or in case their choice doesn't win, to make sure that they're in the streets. That's dangerous too. Now, you're saying, where's the hope here, brother? Like, I saw we were going to have some hope and you're a terrible motivational speaker. Well, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. The truth is that we're not hopeless in the face of, I believe, rising extremism and normalization of violence, right? For every 17-year-old in Kenosha who thinks that they have to defend somebody stealing their freedom or defend a business from, protesters and ends up killing 2 people, there are hundreds of people out there who are protesting peacefully, if not thousands. So again, I feel like the good is outnumbering the bad, but the bad has a much better sort of PR ability, right? And so extremist ideas and news exist in the same space as our legitimate news. It's hard to sort of differentiate them. But this is why, we have been reaching out, to law enforcement officials to provide them information about threats that we're seeing. That's just part of what we do at ADL. 2 is work with, sometimes with a carrot and sometimes with a stick, with the tech industry, right? I mean, where are the places in which people are able to reach, recruit, and radicalize? It's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, it's on Discord, it's on Telegram, and a million other places that we probably have never heard of. That's where this activity happens, and we need to leverage how extremists speak, their code words, with those companies so that they can preemptively find a way to stop the exploitation of their services. And when they don't, when they say we don't believe Holocaust denial is anti-Semitism, we ought to hold them accountable for that. It's not unreasonable for users to hold companies more accountable. And by the way, the better they do, the less disinformation will be out there. The more democracy will be protected. Right? This is what this is all about. This is about not making illegitimate what we have held so dear for so long. I've never seen, and listen, I wasn't, alive in the 50s, 60s, or even kind of the 70s. But the point is, I've studied the polarization and the lack of sort of belief in the system. That's what creates the conditions for extremists to thrive. White supremacists lash out and kill people when they think their culture is being stolen. Anti-government types tend to lash out and are animated when they think their guns are being taken. We need to make sure that in this country, people don't think that their elections are being stolen, that their freedoms are being stolen. We need to amplify our democratic institutions instead of promoting the ideas and the people who want to tear them down. I believe that we can do that. And I'd love to discuss with you how we do that. So that's the framing. And Rabbi, back to you.
Perfect. So I'm going to ask just a series of questions. I'll ask my own. I might go to some of the questions that some of our chatters have put in. But I also want to make sure that we do as advertised. And one of the first questions actually is the question that we kind of advertised. Maybe it was because I wrote the description as a way to try to get people to this, but But one of the things that we had said was that like people were going to come away with just a little better of understanding of some of the groups of Proud Boys, of QAnon, of Boogaloo Boys, of Oath Keepers. I'm curious if you can just give us like a sentence or two on like what are the major groups out there.
Sure.
And then I'll have a follow-up having to do with the Jewish ties of these groups. So
Absolutely. So, QAnon, let's start with that. Not a group, kind of a movement, but mostly a conspiracy theory that is popular amongst actually a lot of people, more so than we've seen in a long time. It started on a platform called 4chan. This is one of these online message boards that I don't recommend anybody really spend too much time on. And it started sort of as a campaign, almost like a joke, right? Sort of this ironic trolling effort. And while it's kind of difficult to gauge exactly like where it began or who started it, I mean, as I mentioned, we have over like 30 million people who believe in it. Essentially, adherents who follow Q believe that the world governments are being controlled by this shadowy cabal of pedophiles, who will eventually all be brought to justice by President Trump. It is a clearly pro Trump movement because they view him as the savior against these satanic pedophiles who are trying to dominate the people.
and tell me a little bit about, there's something about like consuming blood, which by the way reminds me of like medieval blood libels against Jews, right?
So part of it is this sort of belief that we've seen in other conspiracy theories like Pizzagate. You may remember there was an individual who went to Comet Pizza in Washington, D.C. with a gun because he believed that Hillary Clinton, the Democrats, were having young children in the basement that they were then selling, right? Human trafficking. And so part of the QAnon for some is that they are actually, trafficking in babies because their blood, right, enables them to, get power, which, as the rabbi said, is a direct line to the blood libel. In fact, most of these conspiracy theories that QAnon believes in have a direct line to some sort of anti-Semitic canard, whether it's power, greed, etc. But here's the deal. This is so absurd, right? Many of them believe that Hollywood or Tom Hanks is involved in this, right? Or that JFK Jr. is actually secretly alive. And I mean, the more absurd it gets, the more followers they are. This is the one thing you need to know about it, because there are elected officials who are running for office who believe in this, and a few that we know will win because they're running unopposed for Congress. That fundamentally what it does is undermine democratic institutions. So it feeds off of conspiracy theories, levels of hatred, but it undermines democratic institutions. And that, I think, is the most powerful and problematic part. So that's QAnon. Now, Rabbi mentioned Boogaloo. Now, if you thought QAnon was weird, I hope you're able to follow me as I try to explain what Boogaloo means. So for some, Boogaloo used to be a dance, right, in the 1950s. Okay. So for those of us who were growing up in the 80s, Boogaloo actually referenced a different type of dancing, which was breakdancing. There was a movie that came out called Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. Now, why are we talking about a movie from the 1980s about breakdancing? Because that name, Boogaloo, Breakin' 2, became a meme online. It was a joke, if you will. And so, instead of saying Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo, some extremists started saying, let's have a Civil War 2, the Second Civil War, Electric Boogaloo. And then it got shortened into just Boogaloo, meaning having a new phrase, a new meaning rather, for Civil War. So the people who subscribe to this also created online groups of people sharing images, an affinity for sort of military gear, for paramilitary activity. It was really in the beginning of this year at a Virginia State Capitol, at a gun lobby day, that we saw people actually show up wearing Hawaiian shirts, armed to the teeth, who subscribe to this concept of Boogaloo, right? A civil war. It's almost like these little subcultures and little clubs. And why did they wear Hawaiian shirts? Because Boogaloo sounds like big luau. And so it's kind of Hawaiian, so they wear Hawaiian shirt. You see this, a lot of this is like juvenile, But it would be laughable if not for the fact that people who subscribe to this idea, 14 of them were recently arrested in Michigan for trying to kidnap the governor and kill police officers. It would be laughable if somebody who wrote "Boog" on his car in blood after he killed a federal officer, it would be laughable if he didn't do that. Or in Las Vegas, where 3 men were arrested for a plot also to kill police who subscribed to this ideology. And so, it may sound funny, whether it's QAnon or Boogaloo, it may seem sort of out of the norm, and it is, but it creates a subculture that is feeding off of certain ideas that are attractive to people. Because at the end of the day, we all want to belong to something bigger than ourselves. Some of us, we find our meaning in religion, in family, in our work, in our friends. Other people find that meaning through others who have the same like-minded beliefs, as silly as we think they are. And some of those are very violent and they can do damage.
I'm curious. We talked about QAnon, we talked about Boogaloo Boys. We've got Oath Keepers, we've got Proud Boys. Based on your research, right? Monitoring these chats, following these groups, which group, from wearing your Jewish hat now, keeps you up at night the most?
Sorry, I was on mute. My Jewish hat. So, here's the deal.
Yeah, so not necessarily, who might be the greatest threat to democracy, or who might be the greatest threat to, to the next liberal governor out there, but for which group is the most likely to be the next Pittsburgh?
Yeah. Listen, I think threats to democracy are fundamentally threats to the Jews, but I understand what you're saying. I would say when you look at, extremists who have been involved in recent mass shootings. So I mentioned Pittsburgh was a white supremacist. Poway was a white supremacist. There was a synagogue in Germany that was attacked by a white supremacist. Now, we've also had attacks against the Sikh community in Wisconsin, the African-American community in South Carolina, the Muslim community in New Zealand, plus a whole bunch of other examples, El Paso, for example, against the Hispanic community. You know what they have all in common? Not just that they're white supremacists, but that ideology is built on anti-Semitism. We can't forget that the Pittsburgh shooter attacked a synagogue because he felt that immigrants were coming into this country and they were controlled by the Jews. The same reason with El Paso, where 22 people are killed, Mexicans and the Hispanic community, American community targeted there, again, because there's this concept that Jews, and George Soros, by the way, in particular, is somehow funding caravans to come into this country to brown this country and get rid of the white race. And so anti-Semitism and white supremacy are hand in hand. Anti-Semitism and anti-government conspiracy theories can cross over, but for my money, it's the white supremacists, and then it's also, I guess globally, I was talking about in the US, globally, you also have to consider the Islamists, right? I mean, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and those beliefs there, again, steeped not only in anti-Semitism, but time and time again, we've seen attacks against the Jewish community. So I think internationally and domestically is a little bit different, but at some point, by the way, it's all going to become one. And I'll make one example and I'll be quiet. There were 2 individuals who were arrested recently who are identified as Boogaloo members, right? A far right sort of group. But what they were arrested for was essentially conspiring with Hamas. So here you have right-wing Americans who are conspiring with international Islamists. I got news for you. Extremism in the future, it's not going to be left, Islamist, right? It's going to be choose your own adventure, because that's what America is.
Good. So scary also. One of the best speeches that I ever heard, period, in my whole life was Sacha Baron Cohen's speech. Sacha Baron Cohen's speech, like about a year ago or so, at the ADL convention about Facebook and other social media companies. And somebody actually sent me a private message about this question. I'm curious, especially because it's in the news right now, right? These hearings with Jack Dorsey from Twitter and Mark Zuckerberg. Um, what role do social media play in extremism, and what role should what are I guess an argument potentially would be that these groups are going to find platforms no matter what, and they're just going to go more underground. So the question is, like, where is the line in terms of censorship and the role that these big companies should play, knowing that they're going to find a way to speak no matter what, the extremist groups. And so how do these companies navigate that?
Yeah, that's the question of our time. It's beyond 2020. It's beyond the fact that we've been talking about this for actually over 2 decades. In 1985, actually, ADL, before clearly I was there, put out online networks of hate. This is before there was social media, right? The earliest adopters to new technology are my kids and extremists, right? They're the first ones who find the new stuff. And so because of that, it is critical that these companies have more in mind than just the bottom line. And by the way, like, we've almost gotten used to the rules that these companies create. I got news for you. It is not unreasonable for anybody here on these Hollywood squares that I'm looking at to expect more from companies, to make it harder to find people who are promoting Holocaust denial, to protect their users from harassment, to not normalize glorification of violence. I mean, this is the point that we're talking about. These are things that we would never allow if you walked into a store and somebody was saying or doing those things. Well, guess what? These are private companies. This is not about censorship. This is not about freedom of speech. This is about a private company that can make whatever rules they want and allow whatever they want. If they don't want to allow the color blue on Facebook, they can decide that, and they're not infringing on anybody's right. Now, we don't want them to get rid of the color blue. We want them to get rid of posts that are glorifying violence against the Jewish community. Eureka, is that so much to ask for? And by the way, we know that they can do it. Because my team finds it on Facebook. If my team, which is a lot smaller than Facebook, can find this on their platform, I think they can find it. And that's one of the reasons we had the Stop for Hate for Profit campaign, in part after Sacha Baron Cohen's speech at our Never Is Now conference, where for 1 month, we created a campaign for companies to join us to stop advertising on Facebook. This was in the month of July. And guess what? Over 1,000 companies joined us. These are huge companies. And they said, again, not to boycott, but to just say, for 1 month, we want to raise awareness to the fact that Facebook needs to do more. And you know what? Facebook still isn't perfect. But you know what they did last week? They finally agreed that Holocaust denial is anti-Semitism and started removing it from their site. Now, listen, I find some every single day. They got a lot of work to do, but it's kind of like alcoholism. You need to admit that you have a problem before you can start addressing it, right? And that's what we expect. And last point here to your question, won't people just migrate to other platforms? What's the point of getting them off of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube if we know there's a million other platforms that they're going to just talk to other people and maybe even be more concentrated echo chambers of hate? I used to think that was a problem, and I still do think it's a serious issue, but I've evolved in my thinking here. Would you rather somebody yell, anti-Semitic or Islamophobic or hateful ideas in the middle of Madison Square Garden, to 18,000 people? Or would you rather, them yell in a small, hockey rink somewhere in which there are 15 people? Now, maybe those 15 people are going to hear it a little more clearly, but, preventing the large platforms from reaching more people, I think, is something that is not unreasonable. And by the way, You start with the big platforms, and then hopefully that models good behavior that you can make money and still enable to protect your users, even as you're creating new platforms. So I'll stop there, but just say in some ways, social media companies have made it seem like, oh, it's so impossible for them to do this. It's too much of a challenge. Guess what? When you make $44 billion a year, you could spend a little more time trying to protect the communities that use your services.
So we have another question. I'm going to rephrase the way this question is, which is basically like um, imagine you have the ability to construct a government response to hate and to extremism. And you can put in place whatever you want. Money is not an issue. What steps does a government need to take to combat that?
So, when I hear government, I have to ask, like, what is the role of government? We don't want government to create, rules, especially in this country, right, that sort of limit, people's speech. In this country, you could be sort of as hateful as you want to be, and that's protected. And we need to protect that because people disagree. But what we can expect is that if the companies are, elevating illegal activity, like, I don't know, putting up lists of targets and encouraging people to, go out and attack them, that if they're not going to remove it themselves, that maybe government needs to, enforce that. So I just want to say, like, I understand the question, but I'm not suggesting in any way that government is the answer. I mean, frankly, like, government is often not the answer to many of our social ills. But I think what is an answer is, winning hearts and minds at an early stage. Like, education for young people at an early stage, I think, is key. I know that people are taught English and math, even in our sort of remote learning scenarios. People are still trying to get as much information as they can. You know what kids need? Critical thinking skills at a young age, because they are online all the time. People are trying to sell them products. People are trying to convince them, to buy whatever it is, or, buy their vote in some cases when they're older. Extremists are using the same type of propaganda to try to manipulate minds. And I think our kids are actually better at recognizing some of this stuff online than adults are. But we need to constantly train kids to know, A, how to identify hate. And the second thing is that they have a role to play to push back, right? These are the lessons from the Holocaust, right? You're not an innocent bystander. You need to step in when you see somebody who's being treated badly or unfairly or stereotyped. If we can instill these values in our kids and teach them to be critical better critical thinkers, we're not going to need government. These are going to be the titans of industry who are going to make sure that their platforms are not making the same mistakes that we're making now. So I believe in our future. I believe in the kids. I'm sorry. Maybe it's because I have kids.
Look, Ken Cohen just put in the chat, they need media literacy in kindergarten, which might be true, right? And Jody Paroff just wrote, there are some highly regarded media literacy programs out there for youth. So I'm curious, you were just talking about the social media piece to that. What are the other avenues in addition to education and dealing with social media that need to be responded to? One I imagine is probably training local law enforcement, right? But what else in addition, and maybe you can speak to that, but also what else in addition to that are some of the tools in a toolbox to deal with extremism?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to certain extremism, obviously winning hearts and minds to prevent people from even wanting to go down that route is important, right? I mean, if people feel like they belong to something, they may not look for sort of extremes to sort of fill that gap. And that's human nature. Like, we all want to belong to something bigger than ourselves. We need to make sure that, the extremists aren't like the sexiest option in the room. And so, I think it's finding other ways to give people alternatives. The law enforcement part that we work on, here's the deal. I don't need to get a court order or permission from anybody to conduct an investigation because I'm not law enforcement, right? So we're sort of a journalistic organization. I can collect information on anybody at any time I want, and I can keep that information. That's why I would never, God bless law enforcement, I would never work for them, because I can do more not being in law enforcement in terms of investigations. But when I see something, I say something, like the subway, which I haven't been on in a while, tells me every day in New York. I'm able to alert law enforcement. I mean, today, for example, there was a case in Michigan where a white supremacist was arrested, for making threats against a certain family. My team assisted in that case back in December because we were able to find some of their discussions on some of these social media chats and share it with law enforcement in a way that maybe they wouldn't, I know that they wouldn't have been able to do. So for me, success is also like win hearts and minds, do the education kumbaya stuff, but also give law enforcement the information they need to actually get real bad guys off the street. There's a carrot and there's a stick.
Good. So we have another question here, which is, what do you see in terms of, I'll just read the question. I've heard people worry that what's going on right now feels a little bit like the Third Reich. What do you think about that?
So I don't agree. Like, listen, I say that being like, I was not there. Certainly my family was, though. And I think the fear and anxiety and uncertainty is real, right? I don't think it's unfair for people to be concerned. But I will say, like, despite everything that we're seeing, I think America remains the safest place for Jews in the history of the world today, still. Like, we can't sort of forget that. And so, there's a rough patch now. There's a lot of polarization. People are not able to have conversations about politics, let alone have conversations at their Thanksgiving table. There's concerns about violence. There's concern about people not being able to engage because social media is a whole new way of sort of changing the way kids are using their minds. But guess what? For every attack that I've investigated, for every hate crime or anti-Semitic incident, there are stories of good people responding to that, right? And we don't amplify those stories of people coming together, of people being allies. We amplify the bad. Listen, that's my job, is to look at the bad. But because I look at the bad, I have a certain perspective where I know how bad it is, but I actually think that as bad as it is, there are things that could change pretty quickly. I also know, just as an example, I was talking to an academic who studied like white supremacy and the Klan in particular in this country. And apparently, like in the 30s, one day, like overnight, the Klan just disappeared. Now it came back. It was kind of inexplicable that at some point there is fatigue and people change or situations change. You can never lose hope. You can never lose hope that people will change. And like, again, I don't do the kumbaya thing, but people are going to go out and vote. It might get a little hairy, but the Jews are not under attack in this country the way that I think that they were under the Third Reich. And one of the reasons why is because our democratic institutions are strong. If those start to get weakened, or if communities of Muslims or African Americans or the LGBTQ or women, if they start feeling like they're under attack, then the Jewish community should feel under attack. And that's what's so special about this country, and frankly about the work that we do, is that the mission of ADL is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice for all, which means the only way to fight anti-Semitism is to combat all forms of hatred. And the only way you fight all forms of hatred is to also fight anti-Semitism. That actually is America.
So what you just said is a tie-in actually to kind of two of the questions that that just got asked, both of which I think involve this question of kind of the openness of this country, the openness of discourse. The first being about First Amendment rights and what role the First Amendment plays in extremism of all kinds on the right or left. And the second being the tension, which I know isn't the topic of this conversation, but anti-Zionism and college activism and the interplay between the two. And I'm actually curious because I actually think they're tied together in terms of what open discourse and what the rules of discourse are in this country and how that feeds into conversations around extremism.
Yeah, so the anti-Zionism question is interesting because I often get like, what's the biggest threat? And I guess that question was already asked in terms of extremist threat. But when you look at sort of the normalization of hatred and extremism, part of that is the normalization of anti-Semitism. And so while I think, I've talked about the physical and the violent threats that we're seeing on the right, I do think that certain discussions about Zionism, where it conflates Judaism, right, with the state of Israel, which normalizes a level of anti-Semitism, creates an atmosphere in which anti-Semitism becomes acceptable. And so you need to speak out against any sort of tactic, if you will, that conflates sort of the Jewish people with some entity that you oppose, right? Because anybody knows it's not like all Jews are the same. Look, not even in our own homes. So my point is this: I think anti-Zionism, when it's taken to its most extreme, can create an atmosphere where anti-Semitism is normalized. And when anti-Semitism is normalized, it's dangerous. And that's why we need to speak out against it.
Good. And what about First Amendment in general, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion? Like where is the First Amendment in this country? And how does the current state of where you think the First Amendment is in terms of the way people relate to it? How does that play into the role of anti-Semitism, extremism, all of that?
Yeah, freedom of speech is the bedrock. And, that freedom of speech enables me to tell you how much I disagree with what you think. And so I don't think anybody should try to limit, what people are saying. I said it before, you can sort of be as hateful as you want. I don't think you change people by telling them that they can't say something. You actually change them by engaging them or explaining to them why they're wrong. A big part of the work that we do is fighting bad speech with good speech. And I think ultimately that's really what freedom of speech is all about.
I'm curious the role that religious freedom has in this country. What is the role vis-a-vis religious freedom writ large versus religious freedom being a veiled, almost like a veiled tool to promote Christian values? And how do we get back to religious freedom being the idea that all religions in general have the same rights?
So, one of the things I learned a long time ago is to not pontificate on things I just don't know much about. So I'm not sort of a scholar in this area. And so I would say, I promise you, I will give the rabbi the name of my colleagues who can give you much more thoughtful answers on sort of that element than I.
Okay. So do you have any other final things that you want to say, or do you want to look at the chat and see if there's anything interesting here? Because I think we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions.
I would say that it's a tough time. We've seen we're currently tracking, extremists who want to leverage this moment where they feel like there's more opportunity for people to believe their ideas. 20 years ago, the stuff that I would see on some fringe platform that, almost nobody would see except people who are spending time there, really is like part of our public discussion. How did that happen? How did we have a country where, the idea that some Jewish philanthropist is trying to create, bring in like brown people into this country so that the Jews could manipulate and take over and destroy the white race, right? That used to be something that was like some crazy anti-Semite would say in some forum. but we've literally had a public discussion about it. And so it just shows like how precious freedom of speech is, how precious our democratic institutions are. And that, you know, we have probably all taken them for granted in some way. And so for me, it's just, it enables me to sort of recommit myself to this work, right? At the end of the day, maybe in 10 years from now, we're all going to be looking back and saying, you know, we're going to think about the violence and the hatred, or we're going to think about what good people did to stand up. So let me ask all of you a rhetorical question. What are you going to do now? You know, what are people going to say about what you did at this time to fight back and push back against hate? And if you want to find things to do, I really think that there are opportunities. One is report what you see. By the way, even in Montclair, New Jersey, I've seen, you know, white supremacist flyers. If you see something, say something, report them. 2, be an ally to communities that are victimized. Show that you can stand up for them. 3, use your voice, right? Never stop speaking out against like tyranny and those who want to normalize hate. And finally, and there's others, of course, but finally, you know, I think we just have to remember that even those who we disagree with most, we can find a way to reach them. I learned this from talking with former extremists. I helped put a jihadist in jail, and you know, ADL's worked to put white supremacists in jail quite a bit. I talk to them now, they're reformed. And we need to make sure that we give opportunities to people who may be going down the wrong path to get out. And so part of that is radical, extreme compassion. And so if we don't forget that we can be radically and extremely compassionate, I think we're going to be in a good spot.
Thank you. And to clarify, report hate to whom? To your local police, to the ADL? Who do you report?
Listen, if you see something really hairy, something you think is a threat, you report that to the police immediately. But if there's, you know, a flyer, anti-Semitism, something that you're seeing, you can report to ADL. You go to adl.org, and there's report an incident right on the front of the page. And this is anywhere around the country. And we can either put people in touch with law enforcement, respond ourselves, etc. I really appreciate the time, Rabbi.
I want to give a plug. I want to encourage people, the ADL's Never Is Now conference, which is virtual this year, starts November 8th. That was the conference that I was talking about that Sacha Baron Cohen was at, which was incredible. And so feel free. I assume you can still register, right, Oren? And so I know you've got to head out to another session, but I want to just thank you so much. Love is coming in on the chat. Take a look. People are saying thank you. And by all means, let's keep the conversation going. And what a great way to end. Radical extreme compassion. So thank you very much.
Take care.